Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Byron. I am the Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. Today, I am pleased to welcome our diplomatic representatives, public officials to this diplomatic dialogue. Also, our large audience from around the Caribbean and further afield, our U.W.I colleagues, students, and alumni, and in particular, our distinguished special guest speaker, Ambassador Ransford Smith, former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth. Ambassador, we are so happy that you accepted our invitation. And we look forward to your considerable insights on the evolution and the contributions that the Commonwealth has made to global peace and development. Ambassador, your presentation today is particularly timely because the next Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference is scheduled to take place in Rwanda in June 2021. And of course, it is being held in the middle of very challenging international and national circumstances for most members of the organization. There are all sorts of evolutions, fascinating ones, to be discussed in relation to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth continues to be a significant multilateral organization for Commonwealth Caribbean countries, not only for historical reasons, but because more than 50% of its membership consists of small states like ourselves. It has exercised intellectual leadership and advocacy in focusing attention on the development challenges of small states, and particularly of small island developing states like Caribbean countries, in addition to placing good governance and democracy and the very important question of youth at the center of its activities. It also brings together a very powerful mix of large and small countries, of developed and emerging economies, all of which come from many parts of the globe, all parts of the globe, in fact. Now, in addition to the general importance of the Commonwealth for us as scholars of international politics, here at the Institute of International Relations, a significant part of our graduate program focuses on global governance and multilateral diplomacy, and what is at stake for Caribbean actors in such processes. Ambassador, today's session is therefore very valuable to our students as they seek to deepen their understanding of the intricacies of multilateralism and its considerable importance for this region. Now, without further ado, I invite Dr. Nand Badwil, the manager of our Diplomatic Academy, to introduce Ambassador Ransford Smith properly. After Ambassador's talk, I will rejoin you for the discussion section of our dialogue. Here's to a very interesting diplomatic dialogue for all of us. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Byron. It is indeed my honor and privilege to introduce our featured speaker this afternoon. Ambassador Ransford Smith served during 2006 to 2012 as Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat with responsibility for development and economic cooperation. He is a former career diplomat in the Jamaican Public and Foreign Service. During his national public service career, Ambassador Smith served as Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Industry and Investment and Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Commerce and Technology. His Foreign Service career included postings at the Jamaican Embassy in Washington, D.C., and at the Jamaican Mission to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Smith was formerly Permanent Representative of Jamaica to the Office of the United Nations and its specialized agencies in Geneva, and Ambassador of Jamaica to the World Trade Organization. He served concurrently as non-resident ambassador to a number of European countries and has had extensive experience participating in Commonwealth institutional bodies and fora, including at heads of government and ministerial levels. He has also had considerable experience in multilateral economic and trade negotiations and participating as a national or international representative in the work of regional and international development bodies. He was chairman of the WTO's Committee on Trade and Development through the period 2000 to 2001, chairman of the Commonwealth Group of Developing Countries in Geneva through 2001-2002, and president of the Trade and Development Board of UNCTAD 2005 to 2006. Ambassador Smith has an MA in International Relations and an MBA in Financial Management. Ambassador Smith, I'm pleased to invite you to begin your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bardwell, for your introduction, and also, of course, to Professor Byron. It is my pleasure to have been invited here by the Institute of International Relations to speak today. And let me also say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants everywhere. Let me begin this talk by recalling that the Commonwealth of Nations has no founding treaty or governing constitution. It is headquartered at Marlborough House in London and has now been headed for the better part of a century by a 94-year-old monarch. And Her Majesty is 95 today, in fact. I'm sure we all wish her a very happy birthday. This rather unique association of states has been variously described as a global good and indeed as an amiable delusion. My presentation will recall milestones and achievements on the journey from empire to the modern Commonwealth. I will draw attention to the fact that the struggle for relevance has been both a past and present feature of the association. Importantly, my presentation will maintain that the Commonwealth's responsiveness to the development needs of the majority of its members will be a key determinant of its continued and future relevance. This may even well determine whether ultimately the Commonwealth is to be a global good or just, as some might have it, an amiable delusion. My presentation will assert that it is imperative that the Commonwealth strengthen its development role. I will now turn to the founding and composition of the Commonwealth. Let me address briefly founding and composition, the essential aspects of which are generally well known. The Commonwealth is a multiracial, multi-ethnic association of independent states spanning 6 continents and 5 oceans. Members include 2 G7 countries, the United Kingdom and Canada, 5 G20 members, 13 least developed countries, 32 small states, and several newly industrialized economies, such as Singapore and Malaysia. The population of the Commonwealth is over 2.4 billion. The overwhelming majority of Commonwealth members are in fact republics, 33, while 5 have their own monarchs, and the remaining 16 retain the British monarch as head of state. In our own region, the Caribbean, we note that Barbados has decided to become a republic this year. So soon the number of Republican members of the Commonwealth will have increased from 33 to 34. The current head of the Commonwealth is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. It should be emphasized that this is not a constitutional requirement, but the free choice of members. 3 years ago, 2018, meeting in London, Commonwealth heads of government, anticipating that which is inevitable in human affairs, agreed that the next head of the Commonwealth shall be His Royal Highness Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales. Of the Commonwealth's current 54 members, 19 are from the African continent, making that region numerically the largest in the councils of the Commonwealth. 12 members are from the Caribbean, 11 from the Pacific, 8 from Asia, 3 from Europe, and 1 from North America, which is of course Canada. A defining characteristic of the modern Commonwealth is its rapid growth in membership from a small group of white self-governing dominions in colonial times to the current free association of independent states. Ghana's admission in 1957 as the first majority-ruled African member of the Commonwealth can be considered a significant marker. This was followed in succeeding decades by a growing number of new members from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. It will be noted that while almost all Commonwealth members were at one time or other directly or indirectly ruled by Britain, this is not the case with 2 members. Just over a decade ago, in 2009, Rwanda was admitted as a member. And before this, in 1995, Mozambique became a member, neither of which were former British colonies. The decades-old expanding membership and the establishment of an institutional secretariat in London have further deepened the changing nature and character of the Commonwealth. These were developments that served to reinforce the notion of the emergence of a modern Commonwealth. It is interesting to note that a great deal of caution and institutional restraint attended the birth of the Commonwealth. I mentioned at the outset the absence, somewhat unusually, of a founding treaty or constitution. This was not an oversight. The Commonwealth began life as a consultative forum confined to a small club of like-minded leaders, and leading members wished to maintain this orientation. Some might even call it this clubby atmosphere. In fact, Commonwealth leaders, even as they reluctantly established a secretariat in 1965, mainly at the prompting of developing members, reiterated the character and role of the Commonwealth as being a forum, and I quote, to exchange opinions in a friendly, informal, and intimate atmosphere. They emphasized that the Commonwealth was not a formal organization. They also chose to make clear, and this is very interesting, that in the sphere of international affairs, the Commonwealth should not, again I quote, encroach on the sovereignty of individual members. Equally interesting, according to the terms of the agreed memorandum on the Commonwealth Secretariat, the newly established Secretariat, that was in 1965, was required to not propagate any particular sectional or partisan points of view, and to not touch upon the internal affairs of a member country or disputes or serious differences between 2 or more countries. This was caution and restraint on steroids. The question is why? The answer is that this served some influential interests at the time, especially the beleaguered United Kingdom. It didn't, however, last. To understand why the shackles of caution and restraint began to chafe severely early in the life of the Commonwealth, it is worthwhile to recall that this was a values-based association of states. This in itself was also quite unusual. After all, we live in a global community where states usually established defined groups based on geographical contiguity or to fulfill some specific military, economic, political, or juridical purpose. Commonwealth members, however, are expected to profess and model a set of fundamental principles. This common value system includes observance of the rule of law, democratic processes, independence of the judiciary, protection, promotion of fundamental human rights, and the provision of equality of opportunity. Over time, these fundamental values have been embodied in instruments such as the Singapore Declaration of 1971, the Harare Declaration of 1991, and the Affirmation of Commonwealth Values and Principles adopted in Port of Spain in 2009. These values, these various tributaries were subsequently brought together in an overarching document adopted in December 2012, the Charter of the Commonwealth. Earlier, I drew attention to the informality, caution, and reticence that initially seemed destined to be the Commonwealth's lot, and suggested that this might be impracticable. I also indicated that this did not last. This was, after all, an era of anti-colonial fervor and widespread awakening to political, civil, and human rights. The first shot across the bow was a strong opposition of developing members led by Africa and the Caribbean and joined by Canada to apartheid South Africa's continued membership in the Commonwealth. South Africa had become a republic in 1960 and sought to remain a member of the Commonwealth. Then, in the immediately preceding years, the developing members of the Commonwealth, many of which had recently joined, were resolute in opposing the unilateral declaration of independence by the minority regime in Rhodesia. As many of us may recall, this was in November 1965. The resulting high-profile global advocacy and other forms of support by some Commonwealth members contributed significantly, first to decolonization in Southern Africa, and then ultimately to the collapse of white rule in South Africa and the commencement of majority rule in that country. One writer has described the Rhodesian crisis as having been, and I quote, a catalyzer of the post-colonial transition of the Commonwealth. In any event, it was a defining juncture, a moment when the moral sentiment, voice, and presence of the post-colonial majority came to the forefront in the Commonwealth, and did so at the same time as the abject failure of the decolonization policy, weakened the stature of the United Kingdom. This was a role not originally envisaged for the Commonwealth, one of activism in the promotion and defense of fundamental values, and not just in an abstract, universal, and general way, but in specific and concrete situations that involved other Commonwealth members directly and indirectly. It is important to note that in support of this evolution, a quite path-breaking instrument for protecting and promoting Commonwealth political values was created within the Commonwealth. This is the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG as it is called. CMAG uniquely possessed the authority to suspend Commonwealth members or to recommend to Commonwealth leaders that a member of the Commonwealth be expelled. Constituted by Commonwealth heads of government in 1995 and now comprising 9 foreign ministers, including the Commonwealth chair in office, CMAC is charged with monitoring and addressing situations likely to lead to serious or persistent violation of Commonwealth values by a member state. It is important to recognize as well that the Commonwealth also has embodied within its response capabilities an arsenal of soft powers. These have often been deployed in situations where Commonwealth political values are seen as being infringed. They include the use of the Secretary General's good offices, the deputing of eminent persons in advisory, consultative, or mediating roles, and the provision of assistance to encourage the restoration of democracy within reasonable timeframes. While critics have maintained that more can and should be done in promotion and defense of Commonwealth political values, such as the separation of powers, rule of law, human rights, it is also true that over the years, the monitoring and oversight mechanism has not been merely a paper construct. Several countries, including Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Pakistan, Fiji, Zimbabwe, have been suspended for varying periods from the Commonwealth. Zimbabwe withdrew from the Commonwealth in 2003. More recently, Maldives withdrew from the Commonwealth in 2016 after CMAG had expressed deep disappointment over its human rights record. It was readmitted 4 years later after positive assessment by CMAG that the reform process underway in the country aligns with the values and principles of the Commonwealth. Against this background, it is easy to forget that Commonwealth values extend beyond the political sphere. But the Commonwealth, an association in which developing countries constitute the overwhelming majority, could not reasonably nor credibly be impervious to the importance of development. As far back as 1965, the agreement to establish the Commonwealth Secretariat mandated the provision of expert and advisory services and support for new and ongoing initiatives in economic cooperation amongst Commonwealth countries. Notably, however, there was no provision for either dedicated funding or any institutional machinery to achieve this. This regrettable omission was remedied several years later by the establishment of the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation. According to one scholar who has researched the early history of the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation, known as the CFTC, the then Secretary General's diaries reflect a robust view of the importance to the Commonwealth of practical and relevant development cooperation. In documents such as the Singapore and Harare declarations of 1971 and 1991, Commonwealth adopted 20 years apart. Commonwealth leaders have themselves also repeatedly reaffirmed their commitment to sustainable development amongst Commonwealth values. Indeed, it is notable too that the Commonwealth was very early in signaling an organic link between what came to be called good governance and development outcomes, clearly viewing the two as being interdependent and mutually reinforcing. From all of this, it can be readily seen that development was intended to be an integral part of the Commonwealth's worldview. Indeed, democracy and development are the twin pillars around which successive Commonwealth strategic plans and assistance to member states have been structured over several decades. But from the outset, development has been the less favored twin, receiving neither the priority nor the resources that will be suggested by the composition of the Commonwealth. Against this background, it should not be overlooked that while an institutional mechanism, the aforementioned CMAG, was established at ministerial level as a custodian of Commonwealth political values to provide oversight and to evaluate and assess their implementation, there was no similar counterpart in regard to monitoring the state and trajectory of development within the Commonwealth. Despite this, and other shortcomings, the Commonwealth has maintained a significant global profile. We can readily identify important contributing factors. These have included the Commonwealth's enormous convening power and the quality and effectiveness of its global advocacy. As noted earlier in this talk, this advocacy was focused in an earlier period on decolonization and apartheid. But more recently, it has been on the special situation and development needs of small states and on global issues, contemporary global issues, such as debt relief and climate change. Particular strength of the Commonwealth is its unique makeup. It should be recognized that the Commonwealth is actually more than an association of sovereign states. Indeed, it has been frequently described as a network of nations and peoples. To continue the metaphor, the essential software of this network is the underlying shared values, institutions, and conventions, as well as a common working language and history of collaboration amongst members. These attributes of the Commonwealth have also led to a good track record of collaborating and working with non-governmental organizations and with civil society. Interestingly, this was the case long before this particular mode of doing business had become accepted and widespread on the part of multilateral organizations. Two Commonwealth sister intergovernmental organizations were established several decades ago. One, the Commonwealth Foundation, was founded in 1966, specifically to promote civil society collaboration and engagement. The other, the Commonwealth of Learning, was established in 1988 to promote sustainable development by strengthening education and teaching skills. In addition to these two sister intergovernmental organizations, the Commonwealth family extends to include a large number of professional associations and civil society organizations, ranging from well-known ones, such as the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, the Commonwealth Business Forum, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, which administers scholarship programs and more than 90,000 alumni across the Commonwealth, to lesser known bodies such as the Commonwealth Dental Association and the Commonwealth Association of Surveying and Land Economy, and I presume the Staid Association of Commonwealth Archivists and Records Managers. These bodies, numbering well over 80, have been accredited formally by Commonwealth member governments based on their demonstrated commitment to the values and principles of the Commonwealth. They assume rights and responsibilities associated with the Commonwealth name and brand, and impart vibrancy, outreach, and an important dimension of relevance to the Commonwealth and its activities. Especially considering the minimalist institutional outlook that was in evidence 5 decades ago when the Secretariat was being established, it is reasonable to say that the history of the Commonwealth in regard to global engagement has been a significantly evolutionary one. The Commonwealth over the years has become a major voice in a range of contemporary issues and on occasion has broken new ground in advocacy and intellectual contribution. Langkawi Declaration of 1989 addressed climate change long before the global community awoke to the gravity of this threat. The special plight of small states was drawn to global attention by the Commonwealth Consultative Group established in 1983 by then Secretary General Sir Sridhar Ramphal. The Commonwealth early advocacy on behalf of heavily indebted poor countries and multilateral debt relief led eventually to the heavily indebted poor countries and multilateral debt relief initiatives. Furthermore, through the activities of the Secretariat and its CFTC, the Commonwealth has pursued a modest, demand-responsive program of development cooperation in member countries. Over the years, the main modalities for providing technical assistance and capacity building have been through training and advisory services, and the placement of short and long-term experts in receiving countries. Indeed, a decade or more ago, as many as 500 experts were deployed in Commonwealth countries, and over 100 projects were under implementation at national, regional, and pan-Commonwealth levels. The Commonwealth focused on knowledge and skills transmission, on strengthening institutions, and improving public functions and processes is vitally important for developing countries. Significantly, the association has gained a solid and substantial reputation in a number of relevant areas, such as debt management, where its debt recording and management software is extended beyond the Commonwealth, in maritime boundaries delimitation and ocean management of a special interest to small island states. And we see recently the pledge to establish a Center of Excellence at the Five Islands campus in Antigua, involving the Commonwealth and the Association of Caribbean of the Association of Commonwealth Universities to address ocean management. In trade capacity building, specifically, we have seen the long-running hub and spokes project funded with the European Union, the development of a framework for assessing the economic vulnerability of small states, and the establishment of various networks to engage Commonwealth youth. In other areas, the Commonwealth has also made use of its convening power, resources, and competencies to undertake capacity building and to facilitate peer learning and exchange of knowledge. This has been done through the establishment of communities of practice, development of various toolkits and model laws, and establishment of institutional mechanisms such as centers of excellence. These activities have included election management, establishment of the Commonwealth Electoral Network, anti-corruption and integrity commissions, establishment of the Association of Anti-Corruption Bodies and integrity commissions in the Caribbean, and a regional center of excellence in Grenada. Human rights. We have seen the establishment of the Commonwealth Forum of National Human Rights Institutions and support to members in engaging with the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism in Geneva and with treaty bodies. Climate finance, establishment of the Commonwealth Finance Hub in Mauritius, whereby national climate advisors have been placed in a number of countries, including several in the Caribbean, and support provided in mobilizing climate financing. Ocean development, implementation of the Commonwealth Blue Charter, and I believe Antigua is a co-chair of that particular group. Trade and investment, initiation of the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda. And on small states, of course, we have seen the convening of the Global Biennial Conference and establishment of Commonwealth Small States Centers of Excellence in Small States and a Small States Trade Financing Facility in Malta. These are some of the really important activities that the Commonwealth has been engaged in. I will now turn to some recent developments in regard to the Commonwealth. Perhaps it is not readily evidently the case, but on reflection, one can make the argument that in one respect, the Commonwealth, so often the subject of criticism, has been a victim of its own success. The fact is that its relatively high profile and the range and multiplicity of its capacity building activities have tended to obscure the fact that the Commonwealth is but a modest-sized organization with a resource envelope that bears no comparison whatsoever to that of leading multilateral and bilateral entities. At their peak in recent decades, contributions to the Commonwealth comprised assessed contributions to the Commonwealth Secretariat and to its Commonwealth Youth Program, as well as voluntary contributions to the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation, the CFTC. These have collectively been only about £50 million at their peak. Of this amount, about £30 million have been voluntary contributions to the CFTC, which is dedicated to development finance assistance. This is an exceedingly small budgetary amount for development cooperation, an area in which major multilateral and bilateral partners regularly spend billions of pounds annually. The compound matters, and this is of especial concern, the resources available to the Commonwealth Secretariat and to its development arm, the CFTC, have for the most part shown steady decline over the past 3 decades. This declining trend has been amplified in the most recent fiscal years. For fiscal year 2018-2019, volunteer contributions received by the CFTC amounted to only £13 million, which is less than half the contribution level for development assistance and capacity building of a decade ago. According to the Secretariat's most recent annual results report, CFTC expenditure for the financial year ending last June 2020, was only £11.78 million. 4 months of that financial year, of course, were taken up with COVID. The Secretariat's staff complement has also fallen significantly from more than 300 members a decade ago to 212 during the 2018-2019 fiscal year. This situation has led some observers to speak of a crisis and even to raise a specter of terminal decline. Several tributaries have come together to create the negative currents that now appear to threaten serious organizational harm. These currents include long-standing questioning by major developed Commonwealth members of the effectiveness and impact of the Commonwealth's technical assistance and capacity building activities, particularly in the development field. Another and related factor is equally long-standing underlying tension amongst Commonwealth members regarding the nature and the balance of priorities to be pursued by the Commonwealth. Many listeners may be aware that the Commonwealth Secretariat's technical assistance and capacity building activities have been under increased scrutiny from developed members for more than a decade. 3 members, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada, have historically contributed more than 70% of the total resources available to the Secretariat and to its 2 funds, the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation and the Commonwealth Youth Programme. DFID's multilateral review, first conducted in 2011, was updated in 2013, and was updated in 2013. On the premise of value for money, the 2011 review found the Commonwealth to be a poor DFID partner. The Commonwealth Secretariat was found to be making progress in 2013, particularly in financial management, but still with much less evidence of stronger contribution to development objectives, according to DFID. DFID also indicated its own reform priorities for the Secretariat's work. These included, and I quote, greater focus and prioritization whilst exiting from development activities where it does not have a comparative advantage. Prioritization and focusing on comparative advantage was also an important concern in an Australian aid review. 3 years later, in 2016, in another comprehensive review, DFID noted that while the Commonwealth Secretariat had worked to sharpen its strategic focus and reduce the number of projects it manages, its commitment to delivering better value for money has not been demonstrated. The result of all this is that over the past several years, the Commonwealth Secretariat, under the critical and watchful eye of its major funders and its own institutional governing body, has been working to improve financial and project management and to strengthen its results framework. It has sought to design better, bigger, and better quality projects. And there have been improvements in risk management, performance management, information systems, and also reforms to staff structure. Importantly, the current strategic plan also aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, while continuing the Commonwealth's historical engagement on issues relating to small states, small and other vulnerable states, good governance, anti-corruption, and empowering women and girls. The Commonwealth Secretary General has described the current strategic plan, which is in its final year of implementation, as more focused, inclusive, SDG-oriented, and reflective of the Commonwealth Charter. I should note that both the current strategic plan and its implementation and associated institutional reform measures have had substantially positive validation. A midterm review of the strategic plan found that the Commonwealth member countries benefited from the Secretariat's work across all pillars. But regrettably and importantly, it also found that in several areas, including economic policy, youth, and democracy, the Secretariat's ability to be responsive to member country demands was hindered by the organization's resource constraints. Thus, despite what appears to be steady progress in some areas of institutional reform relating to financial and project management, the financial crisis facing the Secretariat has deepened in recent times. In the early part of last year, following reports that the Secretariat's Audit Committee had found repeated breaches of procurement guidelines, both the United Kingdom and New Zealand announced suspension of their voluntary contributions to the CFTC, while Australia did the same, and also indicated as well that its future voluntary contributions would be made at a reduced level. Funding was subsequently restored by the UK and New Zealand in March and June 2020, respectively. This dire funding situation facing the Commonwealth, and particularly its development arm, is exacerbated by the fact that Canada, the second largest contributor to the CFTC, withdrew its voluntary funding to that instrument more than 6 years ago. This was done in protest over the holding of the 23rd Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka and Canada's concern over the host country's human rights record. An important consequence of all these developments is that Commonwealth leaders at their next summit, which is now scheduled for the week of June 21st in June 21 in Kigali, Rwanda. This summit will be required to grapple with issues relating to the financial crisis and the stewardship and trajectory of the Commonwealth. In particular, they will consider the report of a high-level group which has reviewed and made recommendations on matters such as governance, roles, and accountability, funding, collaboration with the Commonwealth network of accredited partners, and appointment and appraisal of Secretaries General. This substantial decline in resources available to the Commonwealth seems certain to lead to a diminished role for the organization, and especially so regarding its development work. Persistent activism by members of the old Commonwealth, initially on resources, their management and effective use, but then radiating outwards to a focus as well on comparative advantage and priorities, would appear to bring us full circle, with the Commonwealth called on once again to undertake a redefining of its role and approach. The Commonwealth, which seems to be emerging from this repositioning, both because of the decline in available resources and the nature of the vision that appears to be in ascendancy, is a Commonwealth that prioritizes an advocacy on agreed issues, and probably especially issues with which major Commonwealth players are most comfortable. And secondly, a Commonwealth of networks and platforms, using technology to maximize reach, engage in capacity building, and cost effectively exchange good practices and knowledge products amongst members. This might be even described as a birth of the post-modern Commonwealth. A Commonwealth with its presence felt mostly in conference halls and cyberspace, but much less so on the ground, where many difficult development challenges must still be addressed. This is a development which has its roots not in the pandemic, but in the paucity of resources. Nevertheless, the current pandemic has served to strengthen this emerging tendency, this emerging focus, by making digital products, digital access, and digital delivery even more important to the Commonwealth. The United Kingdom traditionally lukewarm to Commonwealth development activities, which it views as lacking impact and duplicative of the endeavors of better placed entities such as the World Bank, is, especially after Brexit, clearly very keen on strengthening the Commonwealth's advocacy, convening, and consensus building roles. As current chair in office, the United Kingdom, not surprisingly, has asserted that since 2018, the collective voice of the Commonwealth is now being heard more loudly and has called attention to various Commonwealth statements delivered in international fora, such as the UN, on important policy issues. The UK chair in office has also emphasized his country's commitment to ensuring that the Commonwealth is, and I quote, heard more often, more clearly, and more decisively in international fora. It could be noted that the UK commitment to advocacy activism was not so strong and unambiguous a half century or more ago when the Secretariat was being established and when decolonization and apartheid were at the top of the international agenda for many Commonwealth developing countries. There's little doubt, however, that especially after Brexit, in the estimation of its leading member, the Commonwealth should now find its megaphone. Historical irony notwithstanding, there's undoubtedly considerable value in a Commonwealth advocacy role. The global stage is a crowded one, and voice and influence are at a premium. This can be as much the case for the Commonwealth's mid-level powers as it is for its small states, though of course exponentially so for small states. It is important that Commonwealth voice and advocacy add real value. It must go beyond political expediency and notions of common interests as seen from the perspective of leading members, and must be used assertively on behalf of the majority of voiceless Commonwealth members in fora such as the Bretton Woods institutions, the G20 and the G7. It may be incongruous, for example, to focus, as is done quite rightly, on human trafficking and modern slavery, while at the same time being entirely silent on historical chattel slavery and its contemporary consequences and effects. Issues such as the arbitrary blacklisting of financial jurisdictions and the removal of countries from the lifeline of correspondent banking relations deserve the Commonwealth megaphone, given the composition of the association. A proactive Commonwealth can have no choice but to be unflinching in its adherence to the universality of human rights, including in this the right to development. Therefore, no one should have to doubt whether human rights are as much the entitlement of the Chagosian Islanders as of protesters against police brutality in a member state. It is inexplicable, for example, that the megaphone should be muted on an issue with pan-Commonwealth import, such as the plight of the Windrush generation. One may ask, should the Commonwealth be leading and playing a much higher profile role in regard to vaccine nationalism? In the wider development field, the Commonwealth supports small states, including through recent initiatives which promote and facilitate access to climate and trade finance, support ocean governance and development, and strengthen trade and trade connectivity are very important and will hopefully be nurtured and expanded over time. In my view, and this is the essential point, the future requires an expanded rather than a receding development role for the Commonwealth. This is the best way to ensure that it maintains its relevance, including through a meaningful footprint on the ground when circumstances permit in developing member states and regions. Member states will need to reflect on the Commonwealth they want. Is it to be mainly a political community of states, promoting and monitoring political and civic values and human rights? Or will it be a post-colonial collaborative instrument for advancing political, social, cultural, and human development in all its various and interrelated manifestations? The latter requires that development be treated as a fully equal core value, on par with democracy, rule of law, and good governance, and just as amenable to the provision of practical forms of assistance within the Commonwealth context. This is a path, I believe, to an inclusive and responsive Commonwealth, one that will be a valued and universally acknowledged global good. In these final comments, I will speak to the nature of Commonwealth engagement with its members that will be most likely to strengthen relevance and enhance effectiveness. These are essentially thoughts on the Commonwealth we want. The Commonwealth, whatever the size of its resource envelope, must promote beneficial engagement with developing members. In this regard, strengthening its role on the ground would appear to be a requirement for wider and deeper engagement in the development sphere. Both internal and external evaluations of Commonwealth support to developing countries have made a point that in the past, initiatives have been mostly short-term, ad hoc interventions. The three most recent evaluations of support to countries in the Caribbean, Barbados, Guyana, and Grenada, indicate that direct national support by the Commonwealth to each of the three averaged 100,000 to 200,000 pounds annually. In the case of Barbados, for example, an evaluation found that while some Secretariat interventions were effective, such as the work done in regard to youth, maritime boundaries, and offshore petroleum sectors, most of the Commonwealth interventions were fragmented, small scale, short term, and one-off. As pointed out earlier, the Commonwealth's current strategic plan is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. It can reasonably be anticipated that this will be the case with future strategic plans until 2030. At the same time, many Commonwealth developing countries have put in place or are seeking to do so national development plans and frameworks which mainstream and embed the Sustainable Development Goals. This focus on integrating the SDGs at national level is an especially important development, given that country ownership is central to the impact and effectiveness of partnership and development cooperation, and is also associated with strong and effective national development plans. But despite more and better national development plans, including in our own region, the world is not on track to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. The current situation provides an historic opportunity. The Commonwealth, a family of like-minded members, which comprises many of those most vulnerable and at risk, would seem naturally to be an entity that should be central to providing, through scale-up financing and technical delivery, the support required for the implementation of Commonwealth countries' national development strategies that are focused on the SDGs. This should possibly entail the development of mutually agreed country framework plans between the Secretariat and member states. The process would fully take into account the Secretariat's own strategic plans and priorities, national development plans of the receiving member, and as well other bilateral and multilateral support. Such an approach would avoid the traditional pitfall of small-scale and ad hoc interventions, would position assistance to be provided by the Commonwealth in a strategic and coherent framework, and would guarantee full and effective country ownership, the cornerstone of beneficial cooperation based on accepted and recognized development principles. Importantly, however, in addition to significantly increasing the level of resources from the current low base, this would require structures and processes at the national level and within the Secretariat, which conform to the scaled-up delivery of assistance and which are consistent with improved monitoring and evaluation and with the application of sound results frameworks. This may seem a tall order, but it must be recognized also that an enhanced and robust Commonwealth development pillar is in the interest of all. In my view, it is illusory to believe that the modern Commonwealth can be a viable proposition without this orientation to its activities. And it is myopic not to recognize that there are within the Commonwealth substantial development needs, including in regard to the 2030 agenda, which are not in fact being met by others and that are demanding to be filled. The current moment poses an enormous challenge, but above all, it provides an historic opportunity for the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is being called upon to reinvent itself once again, but also, more importantly, in doing so, to simply embrace the full spectrum of its core values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Smith. I think you've given us a fascinating range of reflections that we'll be thinking about quite a bit in the future, because we cannot possibly address all of them this afternoon. However, I would like to start by fielding a few of the questions and comments that have come in. I'm sure you might want to have a glass of water while you're for a few seconds, sip of water while you're waiting for them to come in. So I'm going to field the first three questions to you. And what I'm doing is that I'm trying to group questions or comments that seem to be along the same lines. So there was a question from Dr. Bardwell very early, in which he started by observing that the integrated review in 2021 of Global Britain in a Competitive Age refers to the Commonwealth's role in supporting an open, resilient international order. Now in post-Brexit, how is the UK, the United Kingdom, likely to leverage the Commonwealth? And do you expect signals, signs of their repositioning vis-a-vis the Commonwealth to emerge at the 26th CHOGM? Now, along the same lines, but maybe coming from a slightly more pessimistic perspective, another question, Elizabeth Morgan notes that in that same integrated review, most of the references to the Commonwealth referred to the developed Commonwealth countries, made references to Australia, to Canada, etc. And she wonders if this is significant in terms of trying to divine what Britain's future view of the Commonwealth might be. Okay, so those are one area which you might want to address together. And the last question that I would direct to you at the moment concerns this, again, this one is from Elizabeth Morgan, and it is echoed by Peter Mitchell. Britain's recent mention of the Commonwealth as an economic and trade bloc is reminiscent of a much earlier period in history. And both of them would like to have your comments on whether the Commonwealth can realistically be resurrected as an economic bloc or as a free trade bloc. So I'll leave it there in terms of starting off, and we look forward to your comments.
Ambassador Smith, sorry, your microphone isn't on.
Microphone. Yeah, you might need to unmute. Can you? Yes. Can marketing unmute?
I think it's now unmuted.
Yes,
I think it's unmuted
over to
now.
you. Yes, it is.
Yeah, yeah. I was saying that those are quite interesting questions. I think the integrated review of really is perhaps most conspicuous in how little it has to say about the Commonwealth. I think that is what one will find in the integrated review. I recall only have one significant paragraph that in fact addresses the Commonwealth. But nevertheless, of course, much of the contribution to that integrated review comes from the foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. The name Commonwealth is still is still central to the nomenclature that is being used by the UK. No, I think the UK, in fact, finds itself in a rather difficult position, because it wishes to position itself as a major power in its engagement with the external world. The review really emphasizes relations with the United States and with the Indo-Pacific, and the tilt towards Indo-Pacific, and very little is actually said even about Europe, and certainly very little about the Commonwealth. But in my view, the positioning of the Commonwealth from the UK's point of view is really as leverage in international fora. The Commonwealth, and this, it's not only the UK that perhaps has this view, but other members of what are regarded as the ABCs, which are the primary Commonwealth members. The Commonwealth is a 54-member body, and it can play a role if it is cohesive on major issues in international fora. And in support of the UK, in terms of the role that the UK would wish to play autonomously, as separated from the European Union, in global affairs. Now, it is for the Commonwealth, in my view, and members of the Commonwealth, to ensure that they provide support to the UK where that support is in the interest of those members of the Commonwealth, and where it is not, they need not do so. The Commonwealth should not function as a block in support of the UK's ambitions in its post-Brexit incarnation on the global stage. So I believe that it must be a mutually respectful relationship based upon the Commonwealth members' assessment of their own interests, and where those align, where it might align, for example, in climate change, then of course the support is warranted. Where it may not align, then it would not be forthcoming. As far as the UK's vision of the trade and economic role of the Commonwealth is concerned, I also think that there is indeed there is indeed somewhat something of a misapprehension. I don't think that it is possible to establish a Commonwealth free trade area, some Commonwealth integration, economic integration role. That I think is not possible. Commonwealth countries across in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, will be establishing relationships within their own regions. In Africa, we have seen this. In the Caribbean, we are striving also to do this, and that will be most important to our economic development. The old world of imperial preferences is long gone, and this is a new world. And I think that indeed, I myself personally, I'm not very supportive of the notion of preferential arrangements, except insofar as where they lead to a more competitive domestic economy. And to establish relationships with the UK in trade or other areas of the economy, which does not lead to a more competitive domestic economy in the Caribbean or in Africa, will not be in the interest of those groups and should be avoided. So I think that there's no question of returning to the past. We are now pursuing more open trading relationships, and this based upon building greater competitiveness at the domestic level. And this is what we should continue to do. And will be good for the UK to view its future relationships with the regional components of the Commonwealth, whether it's Africa, whether it's Caribbean, in that light. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm now going to bring in 3 questions from first time, people who are asking for the first time. There are a few more questions from the people who have directed comments and questions at you already, but these are from new people. One is another economic question, asking, does the Commonwealth see a continuing key role in the WTO to advance the trade and development agenda? Does the Commonwealth see a continuing role for itself in the WTO on trade and development? That's the first one. The second one is, the other 2 are more on political themes. Mawali Knight says, where does the Commonwealth stand on the question of reparations? And the third one comes from George Dans. Is the British monarch head of the Commonwealth? If so, why? Can this title be rotated among member countries? That's 3 questions in one. So over to you to address those.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron. Does the Commonwealth see a key role on trade in the WTO? I think the Commonwealth as such has never played a significant role in the WTO on trade matters. There is support provided by the Commonwealth in terms of technical assistance to Commonwealth developing countries in Geneva, but they have never. But the developing countries themselves have never functioned as a cohesive common, or sought to function as a Commonwealth grouping at the WTO. So I don't see that very much will change. I think the Commonwealth will continue to provide the support and assistance to developing countries, technical support in particular in terms of WTO negotiations, and especially in the context of the interests of small states. I think that will continue. On reparations, was a Commonwealth position on reparations? I am not aware of a Commonwealth position on reparations. I'm not aware that there has been a Commonwealth position on reparations. Their members in the Commonwealth have, including of course the Caribbean, have of course expressed views on reparations, but I don't think there has been a Commonwealth position on reparations. In terms of the monarch, the Queen of England is the head of the Commonwealth. It is not a constitutional requirement or a post that requires that the Queen of England be the head of the Commonwealth. That in fact is one of the defining characteristics of what is known as the modern Commonwealth. That is a voluntary choice of members, and at the time the modern Commonwealth emerged, the Balfour Declaration in 1949, the father of the Queen was chosen as the head of the Commonwealth, and then the Queen succeeded him with the consent of members. And as I indicated in my presentation 3 years ago in London, when they were meeting in London, Commonwealth leaders looked to the question of succession and decided that the Prince of Wales will be the new head of the Commonwealth in the fullness of time. So it is not a constitutional requirement, indeed, but the members of the Commonwealth have, in their wisdom, chosen the Queen and her successor to continue to be the heads of the Commonwealth.
I'm now forgetting to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I have some questions which are varying towards the area of diplomacy. Question from Dr. Scobie. The advocacy of the Commonwealth is a good idea, but how does the Commonwealth Coalition stand vis-a-vis other established coalitions, such as AOSIS or the African Union, excuse me, or CARICOM? How does the Commonwealth interact with these coalitions, which are largely issue-based coalitions? One might ask, what is the added value of Commonwealth coalitions if there are already existing clear coalitions among developing states? And can you share a few recent successes of the Commonwealth working as a coalition in international diplomacy? That is one. And there are two others that I wanted to add to it. I'm using chair's privilege here. I was quite interested when you mentioned that the Commonwealth, that in your vision of a post-colonial collaborative system that the Commonwealth is evolving into, it's evolving into a Commonwealth of networks and platforms that prioritizes areas of common agreement. So is this going to encourage increasingly different forms of diplomacy, and forms of diplomacy that privilege not necessarily only state interaction, but diplomacy at the level, network diplomacy among civil society actors? Is it that we are going to see a Commonwealth that in fact may have a comparative advantage in those areas? So I leave you with those questions for now. And we may have time for one last round, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Byron. The question from Dr. Scobie, I think, is a good one. And it is one that I have from time to time reflected on. And in my presentation, I think I also made a point. You know, the voice and influence really are at a premium, and there's a lot of competition for voice and influence on the global and the international stage. It is important, in my view, that organizations recognize their strengths, their weaknesses, their limitations, and what is possible. I think the value of the Commonwealth is if one looks at, in my view, if one looks at the international stage had been structured at the national and regional levels and at the multilateral level, it seems to me that the value of the Commonwealth really is the reach that it has interregionally, the reach that it has in being able to collaborate. Coordinate might be too strong a word. Collaborate, have structured discussions amongst regional groups, whether it's Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Pacific, on issues that are important, and helping to forge a common position, helping to forge the positions that can be brought to the multilateral stage, can be brought, for example, to the United Nations. So it seems to me that there's a space there for the Commonwealth. And whether it's on climate change, whether it's even on debt, it is possible for the Commonwealth to bring together and help provide thought leadership as well as consensus building on issues, interregional issues that can then be put forward at the multilateral stage, and put forward not necessarily by the Commonwealth, really, you know, at the United Nations or in Geneva or wherever the multilateral stage is. So I think that there is that niche, that role within which we're in the Commonwealth can add value. Have there been Commonwealth successes? Certainly on issues such as debt, even the issue of small state vulnerability. These were issues that were not on the agenda, international agenda, until the Commonwealth focused on these issues and provided intellectual leadership, provided some measure of consensus building for those issues to be taken forward. Now, the Commonwealth certainly does not alone play an issue in taking them forward. But the Commonwealth certainly helped amongst the constituent countries that comprise the Commonwealth, and sometimes even amongst a wider group of countries, in focusing attention and in providing leadership on those issues. Now, the next question I think would be the one that you raised, Professor Byron, whether this post-colonial this post-colonial emphasis on platforms might provide. I think, as I indicated also, the Commonwealth was bent on this path. I believe largely because of paucity of resources, but now, especially in the COVID pandemic, it is, of course, integral to what the Commonwealth has to do to reach its constituents, reach its membership. But I think, yes, that there will be, where civil society, NGOs, this will provide a platform, yes, for reaching those organizations, reaching those groupings, which with the Commonwealth actually has quite strong links, being a body that actually established an intergovernmental body, the Commonwealth Foundation, to interface with civil society. What is important, of course, though, is that the digital infrastructure is perhaps weakest in Commonwealth countries as a group than any other group. 32 Commonwealth members are least developed countries, and this is why I come back to the issue of resources. You know, the Commonwealth also has to play a role in helping countries to acquire and put in place the kind of infrastructure that is necessary to make digital delivery, digital platforms be as effective as it can be for those countries. So the Commonwealth has to be able to play that role, but it doesn't have the resource capability for doing so at this point. And that is a definite weakness.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I think now this will certainly be our final round of questions. Now, and all the themes are sort of coming together, sort of cohering in them. But before I start mentioning them, I wanted to say that the University of the West Indies is very much aware of two of the Commonwealth civil society networks. One, of course, is the Commonwealth of Learning, and the other is the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And both of those have contributed to our own development and have, I think, made us a much more international university than we would otherwise have been over the last 3 decades. But to get back to the questions, there was a question earlier on which asked, how may COVID-19 impact the work of the Commonwealth Secretariat? Now, I think you began to answer that when you mentioned digital diplomacy and the extent to which the Commonwealth Secretariat has been focusing on digitization. Started before and has become even more of a trend with COVID-19. Now and you have just referred to the tremendous challenge of developing digital capacity in Commonwealth countries. There is a question from one of our research students, Liana Silochan, who says, as the socioeconomic landscape changes, the advent of technology is influencing all areas of life. There is a need for the Commonwealth to reprioritize in terms of ICT opportunities, particularly for youth and for young professionals in developing countries. Do you think it is in the interest of the Commonwealth to reshuffle priorities based on its membership? And she raises the question of the Sustainable Development Goals and says, are they a good measure, are they a good benchmark from which to observe where this reshuffle might take place? So I am going to add on one small question to that, which came from another participant who said, on the one hand, You spoke about institutional reform, and it seemed to indicate that the Commonwealth really has to rationalize and focus what it does. But at the same time, you have been referring to the Commonwealth's engagement with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, is it possible to square this circle and to both focus on our 17 SDGs and at the same time have a fairly narrow focus in Commonwealth activities? So that would be the third one. And can I really use Chair's privilege and push in one last question, Ambassador? I have, or you want me to stop right there?
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I noticed that in the 2018 strategic plan, the Commonwealth paid great attention to the Blue Charter and to the blue economy. Now, when you look at the champions, the Commonwealth champions of blue economy issues, I've been quite disappointed to find that only one Caribbean country played a role, was featured significantly, and that was Belize in the Coral Reef Preservation Initiative. Now, you mentioned today that Antigua may be trying to position to get more engaged with an oceans initiative. I'm not certain if you wanted to deliberate a bit more, to say a bit more about that, but it seems inexplicable that Caribbean countries, which have such a vital interest in the sea, in the Caribbean Sea, and in the health of the oceans, do not seem to be playing a major role in blue economy diplomacy within the Commonwealth. I was wondering if you would care to comment on that. So that's it.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll start with the last one. Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with you, because as you well know, the blue economy is important to Caribbean countries, and it should be the focus for island states like our own. I mentioned Antigua and Barbuda because I am under the, well, certainly I understand that Antigua and Barbuda with Kenya are co-chair of the Blue Charter, the Commonwealth Blue Charter, which that is my understanding. The specific initiative I mentioned was an initiative to establish a new center of excellence in oceanography and the blue economy at the U.W.I 5 Islands campus in Antigua. And in fact, the association of the sponsors of that initiative are in fact the Association of Commonwealth Universities and of course U.W.I and the Commonwealth. So that I think is raising certainly the profile of Caribbean countries in that initiative. The center's aim also, as I understand it, is to advance intellectual progress and to strengthen institutional capacity in the areas of marine science and the blue economy for the Caribbean region. I believe that certainly the memorandum of understanding was signed earlier this year in January. I don't know what progress has occurred thus far, but I do believe, I agree with you that Commonwealth countries should be, Caribbean countries should be very active in this field. As I understand it, the Commonwealth Blue Charter is also a very active area with more than 42 countries, actively involved in its action groups and in developing the plans for the blue economy within the Commonwealth context. If I may now turn to the question of whether or not the SDGs would be a good framework for the Commonwealth in its interface with developing members, given the scope and the number of the SDGs? Yes, I think it is possible for that to be the case. The point is that it will be important as to how you approach it. The Commonwealth has a strategic plan with certain priorities. Member states are developing national plans with certain priorities linked to the SDGs. It must be the process of dialogue and interaction between member states and the Commonwealth. They should be capable of the possibility of identifying areas in which the Commonwealth has competencies, as reflected in the strategic plan, in which member states have needs, as reflected in their national development plans, for the two to actually have a mutually supportive and reinforcing engagement. And that's what I think I envisage going forward. Not necessarily all SDGs for all members, certainly not, but certainly on the basis of the priorities in the Commonwealth Strategic Plan, on the existing capabilities or capabilities that can be acquired that the Commonwealth has, and on the needs of member states as reflected in their national and the national development plans. There was an earlier question, is that on the digital?
Yes, yes, and that was a question from one of our students. She was interested in knowing to what extent is the Commonwealth refocusing on digital priorities, and she feels that that would be in line with the needs of its youth population and its developing country membership.
Yes, fine, thank you. Well, in truth, it has been one of the most important initiatives that now exists is a Commonwealth connectivity agenda, and there's a connectivity action plan that is being developed, and the Commonwealth connectivity agenda has a number of subsets. It has business-to-business connectivity, for example, digital connectivity. It has physical cluster connectivity, which will deal with digital infrastructure, and it has regulatory connectivity, which will deal with the harmonization and the updating and the modernization of regulatory of the rules and regulations that relate to the digital sphere. And each of these areas, you have member countries working in these clusters to develop plans and programs. All right. So in my view, the intellectual leadership is being provided, but again, we have the shortcoming. If you have, for example, a physical cluster, which is to look at digital infrastructure and the development of the development with the private sector of closing the digital divide, this will require resources. And it will all depend on the extent to which the Commonwealth can play a role in mobilizing resources, in which it can play a role in providing resources, and of course, the role that the developing countries themselves, some of them least developed countries, can play in those areas. That is a pretty high hurdle to clear. And you know, one can be hopeful, but one has to see what the tangible outcomes are. The simple fact, as I mentioned, this is a body which has a budget that has been between £30 million and £50 million a year in the past, in the recent past. And you're talking about digital infrastructure, the development of digital infrastructure in countries or so forth, this requires huge amount of funding and investment. Of course, some of it will be from the private sector, but at the same time, in mobilizing that kind of resources, the challenges that the Commonwealth faces, I think, are just totally inconsistent with the human and financial resources that it has to work with. And I think that is a tragedy.
Ambassador, thank you very much. You have given so generously of your expertise and of your time to us, and you have really given us a very rich set of information and reflections on the importance of the Commonwealth. And I thank you so much for this. I'm going to hand over to Alyssa Ali, one of our master's students, to do the official thank you and end the session this afternoon. But just in passing, I would like to thank my colleagues who have worked so hard to make today the success that it has been. Colleagues at the IIR, colleagues at the Diplomatic Academy, and of course, our colleagues at marketing. Thank you very much, Alyssa. Thank you for, Alyssa, over to you for the final word.
Our featured speaker, Ambassador Ransford Smith, former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat, Director of the Institute of International Relations, Professor Jessica Byron, Manager of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, Dr. U.W.I, lecturers at the Institute of International Relations, most valued guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good afternoon. I am deeply honored to have been given the valued task of delivering the vote of thanks post today's informative diplomatic dialogue, the Commonwealth, its history and contemporary relevance. On behalf of the Institute of International Relations and the entire audience present today, I wish to express our sincere gratitude to you, Ambassador Ransford Smith. We greatly appreciate that you took the time out of your hectic schedule to be here with us this afternoon. Thank you for your most enlightening presentation, which certainly captured the history and the relevance of the Commonwealth as an organization within the international arena. Our sincerest gratitude for giving an excellent and meaningful discourse on the subject matter, which prompted us to an interesting and interactive Q&A session. I'm sure that my colleagues and I are now more inspired to delve deeper into the debate surrounding the Commonwealth. I must also graciously thank our director, Professor Byron, and all our lecturers at the Institute of International Relations for spearheading and coordinating these invaluable dialogues that without a doubt will certainly broaden our knowledge base on the various issues pertinent to the international sphere. So thank you so much again. A big thank you as well to the committed staff members of the Institute, the Secretary, Ms. Sarah Weeks-Reiser, the technical staff, Mr. Maloney, and U.W.I Marketing and Communications, who I'm sure all work long hours behind the scenes contributing to this event's success. Last but not least, thank you to you, our audience, participants, and viewers of today's dialogue. Without you all, this dialogue would not have been as meaningful and successful as it has been. My sincere thanks. Cheers to an enlightening event. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alyssa. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a very good evening.